Hi guys, welcome back to another video. In previous video we have learned how to create a GCP project and update its billing info and add Firebase to it. In this video we are gonna learn how to enable the required APIs via service usage API and then add Firestore database to it, add Realtime database to it, create a user and create a Firebase web app inside that project. So for that we have to enable the required APIs. To enable the required APIs we need to use a service usage API. So let's look into it. So in service usage API we have this batch enable method. So this is the API endpoint, and what it will take as parameter, it will take a parent, of course the ID of project which we have created, and the project where we want to enable all the APIs, and then in request body we will have to give it a service IDs. Service IDs are actually the IDs of the required APIs. For example, I have listed all the APIs here that we need to automate the process. The Firestore Google API for adding Firestore database to it, and Firebase database API is for the real-time database. Identity toolkit is for the authentication purposes, and Firebase.Google API is for different purposes, like adding web apps to our API, our project. So Firebase hosting API is required if we want to host our app to the Firebase, and then IAM Google API is to giving dynamically the permissions to our service accounts. The storage API is for Firebase storage bucket, and the Firebase storage API is also of course over there to use the different features of Firebase storage API. So these are some additional APIs that we need to enable in order to make the process run and to use the cloud functions and other services like that. So these are event arc API, run API, cloud build API, artifact registry, and cloud functions, compute, pub/sub for the cron jobs, and the cloud scheduler for scheduling different cloud functions and jobs. So these APIs, we will give all these IDs to this API in this array, and it will enable all of the required APIs. The next step is to add the Firestore database to it. So this is the API firestore.googleapis.com. We need to give it a parent, a database ID, and in request body we will have to give it the location ID and the type of database. So here is the API endpoint, and let's see what it takes. It takes a parent, which will of course be the project ID, and a database ID which is by default is set to default, and we can also give it some other names. So the request body takes a lot of other parameters, but what we need is the location ID, a name, and type, and this type has a different options: the Firestore native, data store mode, and the database type unspecified. We mostly use the Firestore native type. So as discussed in the previous video, we will provide it with Google OAuth credentials and execute it, and it will add the Firestore database to our project. The next step is to add the real-time database, and for the real-time database we will use this Firebase database API, and it's v1 beta version, and here we will give the project ID and the location. It only takes a parent, database ID, and in request body it takes the type, and of course the types are of default database and user database. We will set it to default database, and then execute this API by providing the credentials, and it will create a real-time database into our project. So next we have to use the Firestore storage API. Then we will use this API endpoint to enable the Firestore storage bucket into our newly created project. So it will take a name as parameter and location ID. So here is the API endpoint. Of course in this API we will also use the v1 beta version. It have the v2 version and v2 beta version also, but this method is available in v1 beta version. So here we will give the buckets is equal to project, and of course the project ID, and the add Firebase method. So in bucket we will give a bucket name, and in request body we will we will send it as blank, and it will create a default storage bucket into our project. The next step is creating the user. The next step is creating the web app into our project. So for creating the web app, we will use the Firebase API, and this will take a parent, which will be our project ID, and a request body. It will take a display name. So let's have a look into the API. So this is the endpoint, and here the parent will be the project ID, and in request body we can give it several values like API key ID, app URL, display name, e tag, and name. We will just give it a name, and we will execute the command, and it will create a web app into our Firebase project. And as we did in previous video, this Firebase will be added to our GCP project that we have created, because we have linked it to our project in our previous video. So the next step, and a tricky one, is creating a user into our project. So for that purpose, we will use the Identity Toolkit API. So inside the Google APIs, so we will use its v2 version. Under projects, there is a identity platform and initialize auth method. So we will have to initialize the auth into our project. So this is the initialize auth method. So what it will take a project ID, and the request body must be empty. It is mentioned into the docs that request body must be empty, and this will create a config and initialize the auth into our project. And next we need to create a user. For that purpose, we will use the Firebase Admin SDK. The Firebase Admin SDK, we have the get auth method, and inside it we have the create user method. So to create get auth class, and we have the create user method. So we will give it the user email verified, false, and phone number, and all the different details of the user, and it will create a user for us. So I will also add a code snippet for all of this process, example code snippet for all of this process into the description. And thanks for watching guys.